Hey guys, FilthyRobot here, bringing you an update to my builds video, talking about post Warriors of the North DLC builds, and a couple of the updates that I've implemented in my game since the various balance changes have come out. Notably, the whip got nerfed. Nerfing the whip really, for me, killed the viability of the melee hybrid, and I still want the whip abilities in my groups. Whips, I think, are an extremely powerful ability, but I've started getting them in my groups in a different way. The disarm ability seems super useful. Cleaver Duelists were really kind to me in the last couple playthroughs. I think I've been underutilizing Decapitate just in general. Using these a lot more in my playthroughs has shown me how kind of strong Cleavers have been, and Cleaver Duelists, particularly Orc Cleaver Duelists, are really great classes to have available to you. And one of the things I've been doing with that is just literally running a whip in the inventory. No quick hands, although I did try a quick hand build where you could swap back and forth, but no quick hands, just a regular Cleaver Duelist with Battle Whip in the inventory. The whip spec, of course, from Cleaver Mastery, making it so that if you do switch to that, you don't have a penalty for disarm, no hit chance penalty for disarm, and basically a standard duelist build with the damage and survivability perks designed to be a frontliner, but you can spend 4 AP to switch the battle whip to your active weapon, and then 5 AP to disarm. Which means, although you can't move and disarm with this brother, you can stand still, switch weapons, and still attack. This is particularly nice for Geists in the front ranks, being able to kill Geists as they come into range of you, as well as emergency disarms on, for example, Orc Warlords or Chosen, who are becoming a big pain. You do lose a little bit of the versatility of Quick Hands, but you don't have to pay a perk point for it, which is really nice. An alternate to that build is this one here, which with Quick Hands. You can do what you can do with this build here was actually initially designed to be utilizing the new Ice Cleaver, the two-handed famed cleaver that's a guaranteed drop on every map. And the goal roughly was, instead of taking Duelists, take Recover, and then have this same build here and have Quick Hands available so that you can take one attack with a two-handed cleaver, then quick switch to a Battle Whip, and then disarm. And it was okay. The Cleaver doesn't always spawn with great stats, so it depends on which run you're playing. Like, some runs you'll have the Cleaver with excellent stats and some you won't. But what I actually found was that a lot of the times I didn't have the stamina to reliably be both attacking and disarming, and a lot of times I didn't want to be switching to that. So I actually found that I didn't need the Quick Hands option for this, and the versatility of just having it in inventory was enough. And I think moving forward, as long as I have a couple Cleaver spec brothers on the team with Battle Whips in inventory, I think I can be fine with that. In a similar vein, I updated the banner build. The banner build was one of the builds I was least pleased with. It had a lot of floating perk points that didn't seem essential to me to the build. And I have redone how I'm approaching Bannerman at this point. So my current goal for Bannerman, of course, is the highest resolve brothers you can get. But what I'm calling the Goblin Banner. This is a Bannerman with a whip. This is another way to get whips into your lineup without compromising the core builds that you're trying to do to beat the game. For me, this allowed a couple of floating perk points that were available on the Bannerman to be retasked into Cleaver Spec and Quick Hands, so I can get that whip out while keeping the banner bonus out there, making him capable of both attacking Geists as well as being more useful in other fights. I've kept the footwork and rotate, which I've found really useful for soaking damage and saving brothers. The Bannerman often is built, for me at least, fairly resiliently, so they can take a couple hits, and kept the core banner perks while giving up on things like Polar Mastery. I've also changed the stat build slightly for me on Bannerman. Previously, I was building range defense, HP, and stamina. I'm now, and of course Resolve. I'm now building Resolve and stamina primary with weapon and a little bit of HP, looking for around 100 HP with a nimble build, as much stamina as I can get, as much resolve as I can get, and as much melee attack as I can get, so I can actually hit those whip attacks. This has been really versatile for me. It makes it from a build that I pretty much only brought in versus Geists and Orc Warlords to a build that I want to bring in versus pretty much all of the fights I'm taking, except very extreme range fights. Again, the whip disarm ability is just so good overall that I want to have the access to it in my build, in my fights. So not having dedicated Whip Brothers means I'm adding them as kind of secondary abilities on a number of different builds across the course of my builds. All right, another build I wanted to point out to you guys. This is one that's been suggested to me for, oh, I don't know, season after season of Battle Brothers. Everyone always tells me to try a Puncture build, and I finally got around to building a Puncture build. What I wanted to do was take advantage of the guaranteed plus damage dagger, the Obsidian Dagger from the Witch Hut, and build a brother who would utilize this dagger to do something interesting or unique or cool. This build actually failed entirely from my perspective. I found this build extremely weak, but let's talk about what it is. So the build is a dedicated dagger brother, uses a shield because daggers cannot take advantage of dual grip in terms of puncture damage. And the goal for this is to dagger spec for 3 dagger attacks per turn, huge stamina pool in running nimble to keep the stamina pool active. So this brother after gear, after the heater shield, has 111 stamina. Large melee attacks, so you can hit punctures because punctures have a -15 to attack. And then the ability to burst so that you can move into position, attack once or twice, or get rotated into position, attack 3 times, and then adrenaline and attack again at the beginning of the turn before the opponent goes, so you can puncture them 6 times before they can move. Trying to take advantage of the extra AP from kills, the extra damage from getting kills, trying to take advantage of both causing wounds with the dagger, as well as doing additional damage to wounded targets. So the goal is to run in and just kill somebody in full armor without touching their armor whatsoever. I found the build to be extraordinarily weak, honestly. I ended up just building melee skill, stam, and HP with almost not leveling melee defense because there just aren't the stat points to do everything. And the issue with this is a ton of stam. It's insane. With this dagger, which is the higher damage one, it's 45 stamina per turn. 15 3 times with puncture, and that doesn't even count the adrenaline or rotates. And I often think of recover as like a reset to your stamina, but it really isn't. When you have a ton of stamina, when you have like 111, you get recover gives you half that stamina back plus an additional 15 from your standard recovery on a turn, which means it might actually take you 2 turns to reset after doing that burst cycle. I found it really clunky, difficult to position, not particularly strong. It was all right versus Orc Warriors, especially Orc Warriors who weren't wearing shields. It was pretty good versus Chosen, because Chosen don't use shields, don't have that much HP, and have decent armor, so killing them through their armor was good. But it was terrible versus anything with a shield. I tried it versus a couple knights in some of the knight fights, and it was absolutely garbage because you just couldn't hit. Even running fast adaptation to try to force your future hits to hit, it just wasn't enough melee attack to consistently get through targets you're looking for. And if you're in a position where you can take advantage of adjacency bonuses, for example, like Backstabber and a Surround, you really don't need dagger spec. The whole point of this build was supposedly to kill something before it could quickly, through its armor, and prevent it from doing something. And this build just really didn't work for that. So there might be variations on this. I'm kind of curious what you guys have found to make this better. But for me, this was a meme build. This was a build that everyone always suggests that, oh, you should definitely try this, but it didn't actually work for me. And I remain unconvinced that dagger spec is actually useful whatsoever. Most of the situations I find where I'm daggering people are situations where dagger spec doesn't make a difference. It's where I've already surrounded and broken an opponent, or where it's the end of the fight and I'm daggering down a hedge knight, or just positions where the Dagger Master really doesn't matter for a late game build. I'm still looking for something to do with the Obsidian Dagger. It seems like having a plus damage dagger available every single playthrough ought to be something you can take advantage of as a player, but I don't know what it is. So I'm certainly interested to see what you guys have to say about puncture builds in general, and this one in specific, and the things you might do differently. But for me, I found this build to be extremely weak and not something I would recommend to anybody. All right, moving on, a slight update on the two-hander builds. This was suggested in the last round of YouTube comments that I should check out Adrenaline a little bit more aggressively. So I did try two-handed Adrenaline builds. This is very similar to my previous two-handed builds. The floating point that's different is Adrenaline, moved from either Gifted or Colossus into Adrenaline to check it out. This isn't a Cultist run. The Cultist run ends up with extra fatigue recovery per turn, as well as some really stacked brothers. The Cultist runs go very, very long to take advantage of all that. This brother also has Voice of Davkul, which is the final prophet level ability of the Cultists. So this was kind of a very late game Cultist with Adrenaline. it's funny. My response to adrenaline has been very different than the response to adrenaline that a number of other people around me, other streamers in particular, have had. I haven't actually found it to be that good. So when fighting Chosen, it can be nice to control that timing, and sometimes for like goblins, if you're fighting goblins in melee. But when I think like the big orc fights, it's almost entirely useless. When I think the ancient undead fights, it's okay but not great. A lot of the times you're getting the advantage of 2 rounds of attacks anyways, just from the way the positioning works out. It's extremely stamina intensive to be using adrenaline, and it's not actually a damage perk. It is a burst perk. You get to use it to choose when you do your damage, but you pay for that later by kind of essentially missing the round after that. So I didn't love it. I don't know yet if I want to continue taking it. I'm going to probably play around with it a little bit more to get a little bit better sense of it. Some people seem to love this perk, seem to absolutely just think it's the greatest thing ever, and I'm not really finding that to be true. Perhaps that's my usage of it. But with one floating perk point essentially on the two-handed build, where there's one point that has either been assigned to a defensive thing or assigned kind of optional perk on this, adrenaline is certainly one of the ways you can go, and it does give a flexibility in a way that a lot of other perks do not. It lets you do things differently and have more options in a way that you often do not. So I don't know. I wanted to point it out there as an alternate finishing point in the two-handed build. Talk a little bit about my experience with it, and otherwise just kind of mention that it seemed okay but not super exciting. All right. And then the kind of final build I wanted to talk about here briefly, the final update build. This one I really liked. This was also suggested to me in the YouTube comments. Basically, the archers we've been running, which I call Overwhelm archers, was this build here, right? This is the Gifted into Overwhelm into Headhunter. This build is extremely effective versus humanoids, particularly late game raiders, where you can headshot specific raiders wearing no to low head armor and one-shot them, as well as just doing large amounts of damage. The Overwhelm is very good for things like Linworms, etc. This build I liked. This build was very, very solid. But this build, combined with the builds that I'd been running, didn't leave me a lot of options versus Chosen. And it was suggested that I should try out a hybrid thrower build, and I really liked it, Archer hybrid thrower build. And really what this does is it takes advantage of a couple things. It takes advantage of the fact there's essentially, in that Overwhelm Archer build, there's essentially 3 floating perk points, right? Gifted's not mandatory, Overwhelm's not mandatory, and Headhunter's not mandatory. Pretty much everything else is basically mandatory on these archers. Maybe you could argue for Recover, but basically these are mandatory perks. So those 3 perk points floating around are exactly what you can use to get throwing weapons active. You can get throwing weapon spec, Duelists to take advantage of the extra armor ignore with those, and then quick hands to switch to your duelist weapons from your bow to get those out. And this spec was really, really good for fighting Chosen. I was surprised by how good it was. Javelins are excellent versus Chosen. They often are 2 or 3 shotting Chosen through their armor, which is phenomenal. It made this archers were suddenly viable versus Ancient Undead because throwing axes are good damage versus Ancient Undead. So you can bring an archer to a Ancient Undead fight in the back. Still not great versus orcs, although the damage is good from these. The positioning is still a little bit painful with orcs bashing through you. You do lose a little bit of versatility with these archers versus humanoids. They're not quite as good versus brigands. They're definitely nowhere near as good versus unholds or Linworms, because you've lost the Overwhelm ability, which means it makes it a little bit harder to protect your tanks. It's very noticeable in particular with the way I fight Linworms, where I have 1 or 2 mega tanks or 3 mega tanks standing in front, tanking all the hits of the Linworms as my back rank damage kills things. Not having the Overwhelm to help protect those tanks resulted in a noticeable increase in hits those tanks were taking. But overall, I really like this build. I'm calling this the Science Archer build because for me it was testing it out. And then these are my CSOs or CSAs, depending, the Chief Science Archers or Chief Science Officers, depending on how trolly I'm feeling. But I really like this build. I'd highly recommend it. It was a very fun build to check out. And then finally, I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the issues I was finding with polearms. So I've been a proponent of hybrids for a very long time. I like the brothers that are using both melee and range skills together from the back rank to take advantage of generally polearms. But I am having the hardest time at the moment building a polearm build that matters anymore. Because whips got nerfed to 5 AP for disarm, pure melee builds don't seem very relevant to me. I tried a hybrid whip thrower build that was essentially the damage that brother could do was the same damage as this archer, basically thrower damage with throwing spec, duelist, killing frenzy, berserk, and quick hands with a cleaver spec and disarm. So that was okay, but it seemed to lack the damage that I really wanted the back rank brothers to do, the damage flexibility of the archer. It seemed like every time I'd bring that build, I'd rather just have the archer because the archer could switch to a bow. But I still can't find that sweet spot for figuring out how to utilize polehammers or polearms. These are, and I picked up in this playthrough, this one that we're using the characters from was a very long playthrough. I picked up an insane number of legendary and famed weapons, and I ended up with 2 or 3 famed polehammers, a number of famed polearms, and I just couldn't, and goblin ones as well, just to try out goblin weapons. I couldn't find anything that really stuck with me as a useful polearm brother anymore. It just felt like just the whip being on the alternate, being on my front line and the banner meant that I didn't need that as a hybrid, and then the archers being essentially very, very flexible back rank damage dealers who also had bows made it very difficult for me to find that sweet spot. The issue is that 9 AP only really combos 5 with polearm spec is okay, although 6 with pole hammer is very, very difficult to use. The fact this is a hammer and doesn't get the AP reduction off the mastery makes that very tricky for me to use. You're often not getting kills with these. These are very effective at dealing armor damage, but not particularly effective at dealing HP damage, which means it's harder to trigger berserk and killing frenzy. The fact that the 9 doesn't really break down with that, like an archer shot is 4, a bow shot is 4, a duelist weapon throw is 4, a crossbow shot is 3, which has made it tricky to find that. There feels like there should be some maybe like sweet spot between a polehammer plus a crossbow shot for the hybrid builds, but I really haven't found it yet. Every time I build a hybrid, it seems to be a lesser useful character to me than just another strong two-hander or another strong science archer. So a little bit disappointed with that. However, one of the really nice things that came out of this playthrough was the diversity of new weapons and armors in the game, which lead to a huge diversity of builds. So for example, this was super cool. So I picked up this bow at some point during this this playthrough, and this bow was essentially basically a war bow with a little tiny bit more damage on it, not actual damage, and armor penetration. I think your armor ignore. I can't remember which it is. Hold on, armor ignore. A small amount of extra armor ignore on it, but 3 less fatigue per shot. And I like this. I like that there are the weapons out there. That totally changed this brother. For me, for that brother, it made that so I didn't need to run recover on that brother. Still running the same other build that we were just talking about, the science archer build. But because this bow takes so much less stamina to shoot, 6 less stamina per round, it's basically 150% iron lungs, right? Between that and the cultist buff of extra fatigue recovery per turn, this brother here did not need to run recover, which means I got a whole perk point back to play around with. In this case, it just went into gifted because this was a cultist run, and the cultists have a difficult time getting decent range stats, and this brother didn't have very good range stats, so I could use it to supplement a weak stat. But in general, it was interesting to me that the weapons were different enough. A couple of the new weapons are different enough that you can build entire builds around them to take advantage of that. And that to me was really, really, really cool. Anyways, guys, hopefully this has been an interesting update for you guys on some of the builds I'm running. I would really love your input both on the Puncture brother, if you have thoughts on this build, if you may use this build successfully in your campaigns, what you did to make it useful. And also, I would love a hybrid build right now. I never thought I would have to ask this, like a hybrid / polearm build that's useful, because I'm having the hardest time utilizing pole hammers, and I hate not being able to utilize sweet famed items that I find, particularly this one. This one is really sweet. And I haven't found a good use for polearms or pole hammers in the current state of the game. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully this was fun, and I'll see you soon.